I think that's very sad. I think that the general American public has a much better opinion of themselves when they have to sit and read magazine articles that degrade other people so that they can feel superior. I think that's what they consider.
Michael Landon wasn't just America's favorite TV dad. He was also one of Hollywood's most demanding perfectionists. Rumors swirl that behind the wholesome frontier charm of Little House on the Prairie,
TV guy did it to you too?
Oh, hey, but this guy pretends that he's been with me on a set from 6 o'clock in the morning to 11:30 at night. It's very tough to say anything when I'm just pinching their throats.
Landon clashed with cast members who challenged his authority. Could it be true that the man who preached family values on screen secretly hated working with some of his closest co-stars? Interviews, memoirs, and insider leaks hint at explosive confrontations and friendships tested by fame. We'll pull back the curtain to reveal the 6 actors who drove Michael Landon crazy and why he couldn't live without them.
And it was surrounded by men laughing at these jokes. I mean, that was really over the line.
6. Karen Grassel. When people think of Little House on the Prairie, Karen Grassel often comes to mind as the steady, nurturing presence of Caroline Ingalls, the glue that held the Ingalls family together. To millions of viewers, she was Ma, the moral compass of the show and the embodiment of pioneer resilience. But behind the camera, Grassel was far more than just the calm matriarch she played. She was intelligent, opinionated, and deeply invested in the quality of her work. That drive made her both an essential part of Little House and, at times, a thorn in Michael Landon's side. While Landon thrived on tight control of the set, Grassel had a voice that could not be ignored, and the resulting tension was as much about respect as it was about frustration. Grassel's clashes with Landon were rooted in her commitment to fairness. Unlike many actors of the era, she was vocal about pay equity and the importance of being valued for her contributions. She believed her role as Caroline was pivotal to the show's success and deserved compensation that reflected that. Landon, who wore multiple hats as writer, director, producer, and star, often bristled at challenges to his authority or his vision. The two found themselves in heated disputes over salary negotiations and recognition, with Grassel demanding what she felt was right, and Landon fighting to keep the production's hierarchy intact. For Landon, these arguments disrupted the harmony he wanted on set. For Grassel, they were about dignity and fairness in an industry that rarely offered women either. Beyond the financial battles, Grassel also took her craft seriously in ways that sometimes slowed down production. She cared about nuance, about making Caroline a believable and layered character rather than just a background presence. This meant questioning lines, suggesting changes, or refusing to settle for what she saw as lazy writing. Landon, driven by his own perfectionism, but also by the demands of producing a weekly television series, often found her insistence exhausting. To him, the schedule mattered as much as the script, and he didn't always appreciate delays caused by debates over delivery or dialogue. Yet he also recognized that Grassel's standards elevated the material. Episodes that showcased Caroline's strength, patience, or moral clarity stood out precisely because Grassel had refused to phone it in. The power dynamics on the set added complexity to the already strained parent-child relationship. Landon, the undisputed leader of the show, would often imbue such authority onto the scene that his co-stars felt far too intimidated by him. Grassel, however, would not back down. She stood her ground against his charm or status, and openly confronted him when she felt that the show leaned too much toward sentimentality or neglected Caroline's significance. This inevitably led to sparks flying on and off set. Tension would fill the air some days, while on other days it would morph into a professional arena where the dueling would ultimately enhance the scenes. The crew reported that Landon respected and resented Grassel's feistiness. He may have called her difficult, but privately, he admitted to having been checked by her as a writer and director. No doubt, this is the reason of the difference that was most interesting and most striking in its contrast with the actual dynamics of the couple on screen. During the time that they had done the series, they had been on a rocky relationship off the screen. They were bonded by love, but at all times put to test because of trials. Charles and Caroline Ingalls were one such team. In many ways, Landon and Grassel had their own version of that same backstage relationship. Their arguments did not have the same emotional textures, but they could sometimes feel more intense than they really were because of what was going on in two strong personalities trying to chart life together as husband and wife. Only, in this case, a model for a creative marriage instead of a frontier one. What those very audiences viewed as chemistry and seemingly convincing turned out to be far from establishment. The challenges of real collaboration bled into these performances, rendering them deep and ingenious, improviseless, to recognize by audience instinct. What viewers mistook for effortless harmony was actually born of countless arguments and reconciliations behind the camera. In the end, Michael Landon frequently quipped that Karen Grassel was one of the actors he hated to work with. But, like Mel Brooks's notorious list, hate here meant exasperated, not hateful. She was exacting and insistent, and wasn't afraid to stand her ground. That was hard for him in the role of a leader who liked to have control. But he also knew he needed her. No one else could have personified Caroline Ingalls with the class, guts, and humanity that Grassel emanated. If Grassel drove him nuts, she also defined the very heart of Little House on the Prairie. Their fights were real, and so was their common legacy. A show that still stands decades later, simply because both of them cared way too much to ever accept anything less. You won't believe the next name when Michael Landon reveals the actors he hated working with. 5. Victor French. Victor French was more than just a co-star to Michael Landon. He was a friend, a confidant, and a partner in storytelling across two of Landon's most beloved series. Fans remember him best as Mr. Edwards, the rough-edged but lovable mountain man on Little House on the Prairie, and later as Mark Gordon, the gruff yet big-hearted ex-cop on Highway to Heaven. Off-screen, however, Victor French had a unique way of testing Landon's patience. Their bond was unshakable, but it was also filled with moments that drove Landon absolutely nuts. For Landon, French belonged on the short list of actors he both loved and hated working with, not because of lack of talent, but because friendship on set often blurred into chaos. French had a natural instinct for comedy, even in the most serious situations, and this often clashed with Landon's intensity as both director and star. Landon was famously meticulous, known for running a tight ship and demanding that his cast and crew deliver on schedule. French, on the other hand, delighted in breaking tension with jokes, pranks, or sudden bursts of humor in the middle of dramatic scenes. For Landon, these antics slowed production, wasted film, and sometimes derailed an emotional moment he had carefully crafted. Yet, at the same time, Landon couldn't resist French's charm. He might groan when French cracked up an entire set, but he also knew it gave the work an energy that couldn't be manufactured. Their differences were often philosophical in nature. Landon believed in efficiency, discipline, and control, qualities that he felt were necessary to keep popular television shows moving along. The French lavished value upon camaraderie, fun, and the principle that life should never be drowned by work. Contrastingly, these principles set in motion many moments of conflict. Landon barked during those moments for French to stay on task. However, French would wink at a crew member, making a stealthy crack that sent people into hysterics. The crew adored him for it. Landon, not so much. But even in irritation, there was some respect there. Landon could see that French was not making jokes about the job. He was easing everyone else's burden. Their dynamic grew even more interesting as Landon continued to cast French, despite giving him headaches. As a rule, spellbound actors who annoyed Landon seldom lasted before his set. But such was the case with the French, as their relationship ran deeper than any work issues. They understood each other outside of quarrels typical of the workplace. On Monday, French could rattle Landon's patience, and by Wednesday, he may find an invitation to dinner. They often had unhappy quarrels on set, but melted immediately when the cameras stopped rolling. Landon hated these interruptions, but loved the loyalty they maintained. French was probably one of the few people who would provoke, irritate, but still be welcomed in contradistinction with open arms. That'd be the scene where their loyalty was tested in the deepest sense. On Highway to Heaven, there was hardly a scene they hadn't done together. By this time, they really had a rhythm in their careers. Landon would set the pace. French would find ways to disrupt it at just the right moments to keep things light. At some moments, Landon would scour and vent about lost time, budgets, and schedules. At other times, he would deem French's shenanigans a life-giving asset to the show. Their friendship on screen aptly reflected the real thing: deep trust, sharp caricature banter, and unending exasperation. Landon later stated that, without French, Highway to Heaven would have lost its soul. The push-pull between order and chaos lent their portrayals a warmth believed by the audience to be born out of their real connection. At its essence, Landon's so-called hate of working with Victor French was really just love. French could wreck a scene and delay the shooting with the ease of an expert, and he could get under Landon's skin like nobody's business. He was capable of bringing something to the set that no director could ever hope to write: heart, humor, and just a pinch of humanity. Their friendship survived through heartbreaks, and when French died in 1989, Landon was shattered. He lost not only a co-star, but also a comrade. But for all the irritations French imposed on him, Landon would begrudgingly confess that French was also a growing influence on him, in both artistry and in life. It was that very tension, that special mix of fondness and irritation, that has kept Victor French high on the list of names Landon would be forced to confess that he hated. 4. Melissa Gilbert. Melissa Gilbert will always be remembered as Laura Ingalls, the wide-eyed half-pint of Little House on the Prairie. To audiences, she was the heart of the show, the scrappy girl who grew up before their eyes on the frontier. But for Michael Landon, who wrote, directed, and starred in the series, Melissa was more than just a co-star. She was like a second daughter, someone he mentored and protected both on and off screen. That closeness, however, came with complications. Because she wasn't just an actress under his direction, she was also a child navigating fame, adolescence, and a demanding father figure who expected nothing less than perfection. The result was a relationship filled with affection, loyalty, and plenty of moments that drove Landon crazy. Landon's frustrations with Gilbert began with the unpredictability of working with a child actor. From the very start, Melissa's energy was boundless. She laughed easily, broke character during emotional scenes, and often needed multiple takes to deliver the right line with the right tone. Landon, already juggling the responsibilities of star and producer, had little patience for wasted time. Yet, despite his occasional exasperation, he recognized Gilbert's natural charisma. Even when she stumbled, she radiated authenticity. Landon may have grumbled about having to reshoot scenes she giggled through, but he also knew that audiences adored her precisely because of that youthful, unpolished spark. As Gilbert grew older, her relationship with Landon became more complicated. Transitioning from a child to a teenager on a hit television series came with its own set of challenges: self-consciousness, mood swings, and a growing independence that didn't always align with Landon's expectations. Gilbert began to assert herself more, questioning lines, debating wardrobe choices, and pushing back against direction. Landon, used to controlling every detail on set, often found her newfound assertiveness frustrating. Yet, in a way, he had prepared her for it. He had raised her in an environment where creativity and professionalism mattered, and now she was standing her ground with the very man who taught her how. Another sour note was Landon adding emotional pressure to Gilbert's work on set. He would often hand her some of the heaviest scenes of the production, grief, loss, awakening, and expect her to play them with a maturity far beyond her years. Sometimes, Gilbert found these intensities hard to bear. Other times, she would simply break down from the mounting pressures or would need additional coaching to achieve the depth of emotion Landon demanded. While Landon could be tough, he was Gilbert's biggest cheerleader, demanding nothing less than perfection from her. Those times were grueling for Gilbert, and a real test of Landon's patience. He did hate that struggle. What came after was the satisfaction of nailing it. When she nailed those scenes, she gave the series some of its most iconic moments. Their rapport became one that crossed the line between family and business. Landon invited her into his personal life, treating her as one of his own children, which made the on-set dynamic even more intense. Sometimes their closeness made it difficult for Landon to balance fatherly concern and professional demands. When Gilbert mildly inconvenienced him, it suddenly became very personal. He held her to incredibly high standards, not because he disdained her, but because he cared so much. Gilbert worshipped Landon and struggled to carry his expectations on her shoulders. A relationship full of warmth and nevertheless fraught with tension instinctively exists when a father figure is especially demanding. When she looks back, Melissa Gilbert herself would say that Landon was her greatest teacher and toughest critic. He hated her laughter at the wrong time. He hated when she argued every little detail. He hated when she would unpredictably introduce a child's world into his tightly controlled set. But that irritation only scratched the surface. Love and respect ran much deeper and were the very foundation of their relationship. Brace yourself. Michael Landon's confessions about the actors he hated are on another level. 3. Katherine McGregor. Katherine McGregor, unforgettable as Harriet Oleson on Little House on the Prairie, gave viewers one of the most deliciously over-the-top villains in television history. She turned a small-town shopkeeper into a force of comic chaos, balancing outrageous snobbery with moments of unexpected humanity. Fans adored her ability to make Harriet both detestable and lovable, often within the same episode. But while audiences were enchanted, Michael Landon often found himself at odds with McGregor behind the scenes. She wasn't just a character actor. She was a force of nature, unwilling to sit quietly and let the production roll on without her input. For Landon, who prized control and efficiency, Katherine was a brilliant storm he both relied on and resented. McGregor's talent came with a bold personality. She had strong views about Harriet's place in the story and refused to be treated like a background character. If she felt a script minimized her role or portrayed Harriet in a way she didn't like, she made her feelings known, loudly. Landon, juggling a sprawling cast and multiple plot lines, sometimes bristled at her insistence on having her character's voice heard. To him, Harriet was there to stir trouble and keep the story lively, not to dominate the narrative. But to McGregor, Harriet deserved layers, motivations, and space to shine. Their clashes weren't about petty disagreements. They were about creative vision. And while Landon often grew impatient, he couldn't deny that McGregor's input made Harriet more complex and memorable. Her intensity on the set could wear one out. She was well known for her theatricality, either on camera or off. If she thought a scene was off, she would stop production to challenge the director. If a line felt awkward, she would resist its usage until it was changed or she delivered it her way. An already busy writer-director star, Landon used to get increasingly annoyed with those delays. He looked for pace. She was looking for precision. Sometimes, those clashes would throw the crew into uncomfortable shifts, as two strong personalities would rhyme off. Landon would admit, more often than not, that McGregor's instincts were right. She had that supernatural ability to turn Harriet from a caricature into a character audiences just couldn't get enough of. The fact that Landon loathed and respected working with McGregor had to do with the fact that she never gave in to any standard in all areas. Unlike any of the other cast members who revered Landon's authority, she stood against him when it came to certain issues. Because, first, she believed in Harriet Oleson and then in herself as an interpreter of the role as a character, even within a comedic frame, quite unlike the fact that he was the showrunner, star, and ultimate decision-maker. Landon usually said it was like trying to hold back a flood with a teacup. He could push, argue, and negotiate, but ultimately, Katherine went her way. And while that independence incensed him, it also gave the series one of its most distinguished voices. Off-camera, the relationship between Landon and McGregor was decidedly complicated. They were not too chummy in their personal lives, and in some ways, that distance matched up to the way they were seen on air. Just as Charles Ingalls usually perked his head and turned sour upon Harriet's schemes, Landon occasionally preferred to maintain a distance toward McGregor. But there was chemistry that went beyond all that. Landon appreciated the fact that whenever McGregor acted in a scene in such a sharp and unfettered tone, it reminded him of Landon's imagination that set the framework in such a way that Laura could shine. They may not have been friends in the traditional sense, but they were creative partners locked in a dance of irritation and admiration. 2. Pernell Roberts. Before Little House on the Prairie ever hit the air, Michael Landon cut his teeth as Little Joe Cartwright on Bonanza, a show that defined 1960s television. Alongside him was Pernell Roberts, the brooding eldest brother of Adam Cartwright. On screen, the Cartwright family looked tight-knit, a portrait of frontier loyalty and strength. Off-screen, however, things weren't quite so simple. Roberts was known for his strong opinions, his disdain for formulaic scripts, and his constant battles with producers over the creative direction of the show. Landon, still young and eager to prove himself at the time, watched those fights play out with growing frustration. By the time he came into his own as a leader in Hollywood, Roberts had already left a lasting impression as one of the most difficult and unforgettable actors he ever worked with. Roberts's chief complaint about Bonanza was that it lacked authenticity. He hated what he saw as shallow storylines, one-dimensional character arcs, and a tendency to recycle plots that didn't challenge the audience. While Landon accepted television for what it was, fast-moving, ratings-driven entertainment, Roberts demanded something more. He wanted scripts that dug deeper into human nature, stories that asked real questions, and dialogue that didn't insult his intelligence. He made no secret of his displeasure, criticizing the show in interviews and sparring with writers in production meetings. For Landon, who believed in teamwork and keeping the machine moving, Roberts's rebellious streak was a constant headache. Their personalities clashed in subtle but powerful ways. Landon, even as a younger cast member, was disciplined, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to the work. He believed in showing up, doing the job, and finding small ways to make the most of a scene, even when the writing wasn't groundbreaking. Roberts, by contrast, refused to compromise. If he thought a scene was poorly written, he resisted it openly. If he felt the show leaned too heavily on formula, he said so loudly. Landon, still carving out his place on the series, often had to grit his teeth as Roberts derailed production with arguments that, while intellectually valid, slowed everything to a crawl. He admired Roberts's intelligence, but hated the way it disrupted the flow of work. Over the years, Roberts's battles with producers intensified, and in 1965, he finally left Bonanza to achieve its height of success. For Landon, at the time a newcomer but soon to become a major force in the show's writing and production, Roberts's leaving would be both a lesson and a lingering source of frustration. On the one hand, he respected Roberts's guts in leaving a top-rated series and thereby remaining true to his principles. But on the other hand, Landon couldn't understand why didn't Roberts just roll with the punches? Why couldn't he just play the game like the rest? Landon believed the artistry could be combined with practicality. Roberts wanted artistry regardless of cost. That gulf very much characterized Landon's later career, in which he fought for his own control, but never lost sight of the necessity of keeping a set afloat. However, what remained unforgettable for Landon about Roberts was not merely the clash of ideas, but the deeper philosophies of storytelling that the conflict represented. For Roberts, television could have higher aspirations and should aim higher. Anything less than that would be considered a compromise. Landon, equally passionate about television, took the side of emotional truth within the given limitations of the medium. In a sense, Roberts forced Landon to sharpen his understanding of the stories he wanted to tell. Landon might have hated Roberts's stubbornness at the time, but he concedes today the rebellion she instigated sowed seeds for his own development as a creator of shows like Little House on the Prairie and Highway to Heaven. Roberts demanded a vision. Landon gave it, but only on his own terms. Pernell Roberts had been both an antagonist and a mentor in Landon's evolution. He taught Landon the flavor of challenging the system while fighting for creative honesty despite the loss of establishment. There were times when Landon would not have approved, and he'd find Roberts infuriating, yet he never forgot him. He left Bonanza a long time before the series had ended, but his ghost hovered over the set and lingered in Landon's memory. Roberts's name was always among those who gave the hardest times to Landon, not by dislike, but almost because he was the embodiment of that dichotomy defining his career: control versus being free. In that sense, Roberts was much more than an actor whom Landon hated working with. He was the rebel who forced him to sharpen his vision. Wait until you hear our top choice. Michael Landon's final hated actor will shock fans everywhere. 1. Dabbs Greer. Dabbs Greer may not have been a household name like Michael Landon, but his face was one that audiences recognized instantly. A veteran character actor with hundreds of credits to his name, Greer brought warmth and quiet dignity to every role he played. On Little House on the Prairie, he embodied Reverend Robert Alden, the kindly minister who guided Walnut Grove with calm wisdom and steady compassion. His presence gave the show its moral anchor, a sense of stability in the midst of pioneer struggles. Yet, for Michael Landon, who thrived on high energy and emotional intensity, Greer's deliberate, measured style sometimes felt like a speed bump. Landon often joked that Dabbs was so calm he had to light a fire under him just to get a scene moving. That gentle patience, while beloved by audiences, could test the nerves of a man trying to keep a fast-paced production on track. Landon and Greer's ideas about acting complemented and opposed each other in many subtle ways that were also quite visible. Landon liked raw energy, fast pacing, and intense emotion. He wanted every scene to vibrate with urgency. Greer, on the other hand, believed in restraint. He would let silences go on, would speak with an almost pastoral rhythm, and would achieve a serenity which Reverend Alden maintained throughout. This would pose a problem for Landon, who was both writer and director. Sometimes he would feel like Greer's manner was interrupting the momentum or deflating the power of a moment. Landon would then push for sharper timing, while Greer would refuse to compromise his character's quiet dignity. This push and pull created friction among the cast and crew, but it also created the very balance that audiences had come to love. The knocks to Landon's frustration were Greer's unshakable professionalism. Although they could flub lines or lose focus, Greer almost never faltered. He came prepared and knew the part inside and out, with steady, understated performances take after take. On the surface, that may sound ideal. However, sometimes Greer's reliability was too controlled for him, too safe. What Landon wanted was risk and spark and surprise. Straight across the board, Greer would bring the same even keel, whether it was falling apart or cracking up. For Landon, I hated it. Hating it because that left him against the grain of his own restlessness. Yet he secretly admired Greer for his discipline. If I were to say anything about Greer, then the last thing that could touch my thoughts was some loathsome resentment. That was how a calm with a wider scope picked up the bigger story. He was not the central figure of chaos. He compared well with it, even in the case of Reverend Alden. Where storms, fires, and personal tragedy raged, Charles Ingalls Alden provided perspective, understanding, and hope. The measured, slow style of Greer gave the show a great deal of weight in its moral lessons and never allowed it to descend fully into the melodrama of the most spectacular ones. Landon, even when in exasperation, acknowledged he knew that the steadfastness that Greer brought into the show ultimately made it stronger for Little House. Without Greer, the series ran the risk of drowning in sentimentalism or losing spiritual grounding. By virtue of him, it maintained a rhythm of reflection amid the whirlwind of pioneer life. Landon could sigh over long pauses or deliberate line readings, but he also understood their importance. Greer was very humble off-screen, just as was Reverend Alden himself. He avoided all of that Hollywood glamour, avoided all of that publicity, treated acting as a craft and not a means by which one rose to recognition. Landon respected that humility, even while finding it confusing. Landon reveled in the light, basked in recognition, and exercised creative control with authority. Greer seemed to do his work and disappear when the cameras stopped rolling, or so it was with them. That difference of temper sometimes created space between them. He couldn't relate to that silly placidity that was Greer. Landon, high-strung and passionate. But, paradoxically, he depended on it. In spite of the tensions on set, Greer's quiet presence reminded even Landon to breathe. And there you have it, the 6 actors Michael Landon said he hated working with. If you enjoyed uncovering these behind-the-scenes secrets, make sure to like this video, drop a comment on which actor surprised you most, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories. And don't stop here. Click the next video on your screen for even more shocking truths from the golden age of television.